Very, very good evening to all of us who have joined here today for an hour of very insightful conversation by Mr. Minar Pimple, who is a distinguished Indian social worker, activist, and organizational development expert with over 4 decades of experience in advancing human rights, social justice, and participatory development. He has been the founder of Youth for Unity and Voluntary Action, YUVA, as it is called, established in 1984. He himself envisioned and championed the role of youth in shaping inclusive urban and rural development. Under his leadership as CEO for 2 decades, Yuva evolved into a leading voluntary organization working on human rights, poverty eradication, sustainable development for marginalized communities across India. I think founding an organization is one thing, leaving it and handing it over for others to handle it is another and a very important aspect. And also the fact that, this is the work Minar does. As we were having a conversation, he said he's passionate and completely committed to making sure that that there are centurion organizations that run beyond just the founder and much beyond possibly the people, the 3 or 4 generations who organizations are, especially in the social sector. And I think that's an extremely important goal to follow. Over the years, therefore, Minar has held several influential international roles, including the Senior Director of Global Operations at Amnesty International, where he led efforts to decentralize operations and strengthen grassroots engagement, true to his understanding and work that he has done. And he has been the Regional Director for the Asia Pacific at the United Nations Millennium Campaign, where he spearheaded regional advocacy efforts to address poverty and promote the Millennium Development Goals. Again, very interesting work that is there. He also served as the executive director of People's Movement for Human Rights Learning, PDHRE, further deepening his engagement with global human rights education and advocacy. At ADCLOD, the center that is hosting this conversation, we are seized with this idea of what does it mean to be a leader in the social impact sector. And I think what you have done, Mr. Pimple, is both been at the head of some of these organizations, and now you are using your area of expertise as a consultant, as somebody who helps other organizations address some of these issues, succession, new leadership development, ensuring that there isn't a mission drift, or looking at how to be operationally more effective. And that is your work as the principal consultant at MP Consulting and Services. And you not only have built, but you have mentored organizations and leaders in the social sector. So we are very fortunate to have you as part of this conversation. And I really I mean it's a pleasure for us to listen and learn from you. And in my other conversation with you, and this I think I would like to share with the audience, is that Mr. Pimple doesn't necessarily only come from the perspective of I know it all. He is a keen learner, and he has set a goal for himself that every year he will at least invest a little time learning something new. And that is, again, something that I believe is a mark of a leader. So not only do you help leaders develop, but I think you're also a leader. And we're very happy to listen to you. And also, just for a moment, I'd like to introduce Ashank Desai, who's also part of the audience here. He's, of course, the patron of this center. So thank you again, Ashank, for conceiving of this idea and also joining us this evening. So I think I will not stay too much between us and And you, Mr. Pimple, I think the other person that you might just want to say hello to is Arun Shrikumar. He's a faculty at IIM Ahmedabad and has also kindly joined us. So I really welcome all the participants. Thank you for joining in, and I hope we have a really, really good session. What we will do is we will first listen to what Mr. Minar Pimple has to share with us. If you have questions, please keep putting them in the chat. And once he is done, then we will open it up for questions. And if we can do the questions that come first, and then we can keep building on the conversation. So looking forward to listening from you and learning from you, Mr. Pimple. And thank you very much for agreeing to do this. Thank you. And all over to you.
Thank you, Professor Vora. Thank you very much. And welcome to Mr. Desai. I don't know whether he's called professor or not, but the center is named after him, and Professor Sri Kumar, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And thank you very much for all the people who have joined this seminar. And thanks Sukruti, who I had an opportunity to interact, and she felt that it may be a good idea to do this seminar under the ADCLOD, aegis of ADCLOD. So let me begin. My journey began in 1984 at UA, but that was not the beginning of the journey. I think it is important to know, I always say in my coaching session, it's not only who you are, from where you have arrived is as important as who you are. And when I say from where have you arrived, it doesn't mean geographically, which state you come from. No, it's what has been your life journey. That's as critical. So my education, early education, was in a government school, a Marathi medium school in the district of Ratnagiri, in a taluka place called Khed. And 7th standard, I shifted for my education, again continuing the Marathi medium till the 10th standard. So it is important because I always look at power and privilege as one of the frame in which you should view leadership processes, because power and privilege is something which many times people don't want to recognize, don't want to take notice of. So that is why it is important to note from where you arrive. And for leaders, it's important to understand when they work with teams, when they work with their senior leadership teams, they need to know it's not only who they are at this point of time, but from what is their journey. And it makes a lot of difference from where you've come. So in 1984, just cutting it short, I started as the founding team of UA, Youth for Unity and Voluntary Action. And before that, because of my student activism post-emergency, there was a lot of new thinking, a lot of young students wanting to do something better. As some of you would remember, Jayaprakash Narayan, which was one of the tallest leaders, he had given that call for social change, social transformation. And a lot of the young people went into adult education, working with communities, whether it's indigenous people, tribal communities, whether the scheduled caste communities, and really how do we really bring them up? And I was involved in that process before I joined Bachelor of Social Work in 1979. So 77, 78 post-emergency, and then 79 I joined Bachelor of Social Work. My first project, in a way, was very, very interesting. People in Mumbai know when the Maharashtra new council building was being built, my work started with the children of those construction workers. And because otherwise they had no other meaningful activity, because both their parents would be at the construction site building the council hall, which is a big building, very landmark building now in Mumbai. And the kids of those construction workers were just hanging around in a ground nearby called Cooperage Ground. And that's where I began, in starting with how do we educate these children? How do we bring them into the mainstream? So that is how it began. And through that process of learning, when I graduated in 1982, I was employed immediately under a project called Youth Project in College of Social Work. And that was, in a way, the foundation of UA in 1984. What is important to understand, and many of the people who are academic here will, my another obsession at that point of time was, social work education curricula was predominantly coming from the American universities. And there were some professors, Professor Dasgupta, namely, who was also social work educator, and Dr. Ashank Desai, some of you may have heard her name. She retired as a UGC chairperson, University Grants Commission chairperson, and she unfortunately passed away a few months back. they were like really inspirations for me, because their attempt was, how do we adapt this curriculum to the Indian context, to the Indian realities, to the Indian situation. Okay, so that was one of the challenge which was put, that how do we really look at education, social work education and social work practice from the Indian frame. And your starting point was from that perspective, that in the beginning, Youth for Unity and Voluntary Action Board was all social work professionals from different universities in India, but only social work professionals were the board members, because they were in a way guiding you are to be one of the first experiments to really look at, indigenizing the social work education and practice. Okay, otherwise you had these traditional methods of what is called work with individuals, work with families, work with groups. That was the kind of a framework in which the social work education, and unfortunately in some the schools of social work, we still are following those kinds of methodologies. I hope they're able to adapt in the beginning. So that was the beginning of UA. And that whole process of starting something, there's a role that serendipity plays in any of these things. The two professors with whom I was closely working had decided to resign from the College of Social Work as lecturers and professors, and wanted to go and actually work with the tribal communities in Andhra Pradesh, then Andhra Pradesh, in Visakhapatnam. And then I was asked whether I would be the one who would lead this transition from youth project in College of Social Work to establishing an independent, not-for-profit organization called UA, Youth for Unity and Voluntary Action. And that is how UA began. And that's the journey that has in a way shaped me and informed all the things that I have done after starting UA. What is critical is what I learned during that period, that books are important, learning is important, but just books is not what is going to take you any further. You also need to have a very strong understanding of what's happening on the streets, what's happening in the communities, how people are, what are people's dreams, what are people's aspirations. So hearing the community voices, learning from them, building their trust, I think was a key currency in the early stages of my work. Because many times when you say, what is your capital? That trust is your capital in the social sector. To become a good leader, that communities trust the credentials that they have, you have with them and they have with you. That interaction is absolutely critical. So from my perspective, a critical thing for any social sector leader is, not to have his or her or their ego outgrow the empathy that is critical. So empathy and strategy in a way play both are important in any kind of a leadership roles in the social sector. So in that process, the two frames that I have used continuously as a guide to my work is, one, whatever I will do should be contributing towards, and it's not only about India because I worked globally, contribute towards strengthening and deepening democracy. Because when people ask me, is there an alternative to democracy? My response to them is, deepening democracy is the alternative to democracy, basically. So that's been my response, because that's one frame which is quite important. Second, what is important from my perspective, and that has also framed all my work, is whatever I do must support the agency and the voice of the community and people. Because that is how citizenship gets built. That is how the citizenship gets strengthened. And that's where the issue of understanding power and privilege from where you come, from others come, becomes quite critical. Because building agency, building voice is a function of understanding, appreciating, learning about the power and privileges you come from. So that awareness, both these frames become quite critical for you to be a very aware and informed social sector leader. So with that introduction, what I'm going to take you through today is kind of 3 stages, which in a way cover the 4 decades and of my involvement from 1984 to 2024, and then 2024 and beyond. In the first stage, as if some of you are founders of or startup people, you will know what we call basically the founder's hustle. So the first phase in UA, I used to call myself a street performer. the analogy, because you need to create some, you need to beat the drums, gather people, show some acrobatics, and collect money to deliver something that people like. So that's the analogy of that. So the hustler phase from 1984 to about 2004, sorry, 1994, that 84 to 94, the first decade, was quite important, and there was a lot of learning in that process. One critical learning is the leadership. Your leadership flowers how, depending on how proximate you are to the problems that you're working on. And during that period, we coined the slogan, Jiska Sawal Uska Netrutva. So in English, it simply means those who face the problem are better placed to lead on those problems. So basically, Jiska Sawal Uska Netrutva became a kind of a slogan for us to organize. So how do we build leadership among youth? How do we build leadership among women? Because those were the two sectors that we were focusing on to really build the community change processes that we wanted to undertake. And what was critical in that phase of from 1984 to 1994, that 10 years, was the key thing of agility. It was founded in 1984. 1985, the first major crisis. Some of you may remember there was a chief minister in Maharashtra who decided one fine day during monsoon season, decided to evict all the pavement dwellers of the Mumbai city. And all those pavement dwellers were dumped into the state transport buses and were left to respective borders. If they're coming from Karnataka, they were left on the Karnataka border. If they're coming from Andhra, they were left on the Andhra border. And that was seen as a major issue. And we are talking about anything from 700,000 people to 1 million people being evicted in that phase, under when it's heavy rains are happening in the month of June. So that's the first time the whole issue of how do we pivot from something that we are doing as a planned activity with our projects that were coming to you. But this is a new reality that is confronting us, and we need to be involved in that struggle for justice of these communities that they are fighting. And that is when one of the realizations that I did was some of these struggles cannot be individual NGOs or individual organizations. We have to build collaborations. And just to keep the story short, in 1985, we established something called Committee for the Right to Housing. So almost all the non-governmental organizations, all the civil society sector organizations were brought together under one umbrella so that they can speak in a united voice. That then led to evictions are not only happening in Mumbai or in Maharashtra, they are happening in Bangalore, they are happening in Madras. Now, of course, it's Chennai, Bangalore, they are happening in Delhi. How do we collaborate? That's how the formation of the National Campaign for Housing Rights happened. Then we started, as we formed the National Campaign for Housing Rights, we realized, but they are also happening in Dhaka, they are also happening in Karachi, they are also happening in Kathmandu, they are happening in Bangkok. And that was the birth of what is called the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights. So from 85, from a local committee for the right to housing, we built the National Campaign for Housing Rights, we built the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, and then 1987, we had, because if we want to present some of these issues in the global forums like United Nations Agency for Habitat, we needed to have a global platform. And that is why the housing, Habitat International Coalition was born. So you can see 84 we got established. By 87, we were already onto this forums, which were city-based forums, national forums, Asian regional forums, and the global forums. So again, the realization that agility, because once you understand the issue, your leadership must get defined by how you respond to that issue. When you start looking at, okay, so housing policy, housing is a subject, a state subject as far as the Indian Constitution is concerned. But the policy making also happens at the national level. There is no national housing policy. What do we do about it? So all those questions then lead to what are the organizational forms which are appropriate to tackle that issue at various levels. So again, that's when the leadership comes into in terms of agility, understanding what is required of that context, and how do you create an intervention or a response which can actually look at that issue in a more comprehensive fashion. Next phase, 1992, 92, 93 riots after the demolition of the Babri Mosque. As you know, That was a very significant turning point in India, because the riots were really intense. And we were working in Jogeshwari, which unfortunately became the epicenter of the or the justification for the riots in the city, because of something called Radhabai Chaul, where the first kind of a burning of the family happened. That was kind of an allegation around which the whole thing was built. Again, to keep the story short, uh, you then decided that we don't want to create boundaries within the communities. So you actually bought over that chawl and created a communal harmony center. And it's really interesting that Suketu Mehta, when he wrote his big novel called Maximum City, he mentions that. He mentions that, Radhabai Chawl is now a communal harmony center, because we didn't want that boundaries to be created within the communities. Now, here, the issue of moral courage comes into the place. What happened? There was an inquiry commission set up into the riots called Sri Krishna Commission, Justice Sri Krishna Commission. UA had published a report called Planned Segregation. We, using all the human rights instruments globally available, Indian Constitution, we created that publication called Planned Segregation. That planned segregation was submitted to the commission. When it was submitted to the commission, of course, commission was an open inquiry commission, which meant that when you submit a document, you have to come into the court and defend that document. Okay, the principal researcher of that study was afraid that she may get targeted, whatever. And then I, as a leader, said, okay, I will be the one who will actually stand up in front of the inquiry commission, face the questions coming from all the lawyers. So that's when you see the whole issue of moral courage, because these are the times when leadership gets defined, whether you're going to stand up to what you have said. And that's the moral courage is, do you have the ability to speak truth to the power? The agility is what I call the adaptive grit. Are you able to pivot to something that is critical at that point of time? Are you willing to change your prioritization to deal with what is coming onto you, which was not planned by you, but which is something which is significant from the perspective of social justice? That 1992-93 riots, followed by Latur earthquake. That was the first time we had to really build our humanitarian muscle. So many of you understand the humanitarian work is to intervene in areas of humanitarian crisis, and earthquake is considered as one of the large humanitarian crises. So that is where we got involved. And that's the first time, again, I said, you as expertise on managing the ground level processes, community processes. But we are not experts in planning and defining architectural work. So we need to have a collaboration with the institution which can provide that. So we connected with something called the Action Research Unit, Taru, and the founder of that organization is now heads the Habitat Center in Bangalore, Aromar Ravi. So you can see some of those linkages quite clearly. And HDFC, that time Deepak Parekh was still heading it. So he was the funder of planning for a resettlement village called Holi Village in Latur district, as a kind of a planned intervention, and that could become a model for others. So in 84 to 1994, those 10 years themselves, you can see that though we had undergone a process of strategic planning by 1990, we were lucky. We had friends like Gagan Sethi, who is from Jan Vikas in Ahmedabad. He helped us do the strategic plan in 1990. But what learning I got from that, business plan in case of social sector must be written in pencil, because you are supposed to be responding to the realities which are coming around you. They cannot be written in stone. They cannot be completely finalized, because if you are rigid and refuse to pivot yourself during the crisis, you aren't leading. You are basically, managing the fading map of your strategic plan. So that's a kind of a learning that I got in that first phase, when you grew from just 1+1 person, because I was also doing my master's simultaneously when you got established. So 84, 85, 85, 86, I was also a student of Master of Social Work. We had just done the graduation. So I was continuing my master's work, as well as I was leading UA with one or two community organizers whom I had trained as part of the leadership development, who were working with me in that process. So that's the first phase in brief about UA's, what I call the founder's hustle. Then came the next stage from 1994 till I left UA in 2020, 2004. Those kind of 15, 20 years in that phase. That phase is exactly what you referred to, Professor Vora, in the beginning before the seminar began, is when I said, if you want a sustainable centurion organization, we need to follow the process of institutionalization. You have to move the leadership from I to we. It's no more I, it's building that we as a team, building that process. So institutionalization process. Now, the second most important work that I started doing. So during that period, two major processes that happened. One was I was asked by Oxfam, who was one of the funders of UA, to lead the process of integration of 6 Oxfams into one Oxfam. So it was like in the corporate language, it was called acquisitions and mergers, but it was not it was a merger in that sense of 6 Oxfams into one identity called Oxfam India, with the Indian identity, with the Indian board, with the Indian leadership. That was a key kind of a process. And that was the first time I also had the Accenture Development Program as my partner, as a consulting partner to help us for a 2-year period. So it was not the issue of financial integration. You had 6 Oxfams who had totally different ways of working. You had one Oxfam who would give large monies to their partners for building those institutions. You had another Oxfam who was present on the ground, giving smaller grants, but will be on in your everyday in your office by asking for something or the other. So you had people who were over involved and people who were hardly involved. So people who were hardly involved, we used to call them Santa Clauses, because they would only come in November and December before they went back for Christmas from Europe. One of the Oxfams that would do that. So that whole process also gave me the exposure of really understanding not only the mechanisms, the backend structures and backend platforms on which those organizations are built, but the culture, how different cultures operate. And it took me almost a period of 10 years in fully managing that transition and transformation and bringing them all together. And the final stage where I basically said, okay, so now as the chair of the board, my responsibility, I need to hand over to somebody else who will lead the next process. And I need to recruit somebody as a very effective, efficient chief executive officer to be operational head of Oxfam India. Both those processes I completed and I left. In the same period, what happened was because I was already, when UA was 10 years old, I was already telling the board, I think I have done enough now. I've led the foundations. I better get moving, because if you want to build a centurion organization, I don't want to build an organization which is dependent on me. I want to build an institution which will remain in spite of me, which will sustain in spite of me. And then the board chair put a big challenge to me when ultimately it was accepted when you was 15 years old, that yes, Minar should be allowed to move, because now he has moved into a different space internationally. He has a complete different recognition. And one learning there is those leaders who don't leave either drag their organizations behind them when the organizations are not ready, or those leaders themselves actually stop growing and pull down the organization. The organization has the capacity to go further, but the leaders have reached their plateau. Both things can happen, and that's it's important for any leader to really understand when to depart, when to exit, and do the exit responsibly. That was a critical piece. So the board asked me, Minar, we are not going to find anybody who is going to look at issues of organic farming at one end, issues of presenting, urban processes in the Planning Commission working group and the youth process in the Planning Commission working group, on the issues of environment and climate change. We're not going to get one person who has all these kinds of competencies, because I had grown with the organization. So I had evolved. I wouldn't call myself expert in any of these areas, but I knew enough to work with the experts in these areas. Okay. So basically the challenge which was put to me is reorganize UA as different institutions around core competencies. And that is when you are urban, you are rural, you are consulting, you are center. All these institutions got built, separated with their governance structures, with their leadership, because we had already built a second line leadership that could easily take over from me. And that is how the structure was established. That process of doing that took another 5 years. So by the time I left UA in 2004, it was already 20 years of leading UA. So my whole youth from the age of 23 to the age of 43, I was in a way in these processes. And the key lessons that you must understand here, and UA consulting I established, I said, we are not interested in replicating UA. We are not interested in establishing UA. What we are interested in, replicating UA's methodology, UA's values, UA's ways of working, because that is what will sustain, not creating, expanding ourselves as UA brand anywhere in different parts of India. So that was the key thing. So scaling, many times people misunderstand. Scaling is not numbers as far as social sector is concerned. It's also numbers, but alongside numbers, it's a scaling of values. It's a scaling of impact. That is what the assessment, when you look at the scale up that people are talking about, the assessment should be, have the values by which this organization was founded. Are those values still remain when they're at a scale up stage? Are those methodologies, are those the frame of creating agency and voice of the communities, is that continued to happen? Or in the scale up, obsession of scale up, you are actually started basically treating people as targets, people as objects rather than the active subjects and participants who are active citizens of that process. So that's the kind of a learning that I did that in that phase. And 2004 onwards, and I have been in the international arena from 2004 to 2024 with various roles, as you outlined in my introduction. I started working as the executive director for the PDHRE, where one of the largest projects that I managed, which was in collaboration with the UNDP, called looking at building human rights cities, communities, and villages. So from Rosario in Argentina to Kathi in Mali, to Dinajpur in Bangladesh, we were really looking at the projects all over the world in really building those communities. And some of you who are from the social sector may have heard there is a whole movement called Human Rights Cities committed to Human Rights Declaration and who are willing to implement the human rights protocols in their own cities. So there is that whole movement. But we were in the very beginning of that stage when we actually build that framework. Another learning there, very important learning. The founders, again, my experience as a professional is to build institutions and move away. In that case, because I was wanting to do the same thing in terms of PDHRE, I said, I'll give you 3 to 4 years, build it up, put it on a good footing, and then leave. But the founder was not willing to leave. Founder was much wanting to be actually in day-to-day decision making. And I came to a conclusion that that's not something which is going to work for me, because that's not why I have come in here. I have come in here to build this institution and then depart. But if the founder is going to be continuously intervening, and that is when I had the opportunity. And again, now the word that I use, serendipity. Serendipity does play a role in our lives. Let's be very honest about it. It's not that everybody is present at the right time at the right place. What happened? That time, United Nations Millennium Development Goals, which were established in year 2000. Year 2000, as you know, is the millennium year, when we shifted from 2000 to 2001 onwards. So 2000, Global Assembly of the United Nations adopted something called Millennium Development Goals. And the idea was that how the Millennium Development Goals will be implemented in different countries, because different countries had signed up to the declaration of the Millennium for the Millennium Development Goals in the General Assembly, United Nations General Assembly. So I was asked to do a consulting work that time as part of the PDHRE to review what are the potential of building a Millennium Campaign, which is the campaign to hold governments to account on delivery of Millennium Development Goals in the Asia Pacific region. I did that consultancy for 6 months, prepared the report, went back to the UN. I was based in New York that time. Went back to the director of the campaign and said, this is my report. And he said, Minar, actually, we will be now looking at somebody who will come as a deputy director, who will actually implement your recommendations that you have outlined in the report. Will you be interested? Now look at this, the kind of a serendipity that is happening. I had these stresses and tensions in my present job with PDHRE. I had this opportunity. I jumped on that opportunity. And I may be one of the few people who got laterally recruited in the UN to head the regional campaign. And then I was shifted from New York to Bangkok, because Bangkok has a big UN center to lead the campaign in the Asia Pacific region. That's how the UN Millennium Campaign came about. But again, the issue of story of moral courage. As part of my role of holding governments to account, one of the things was to keep telling governments where they are not doing right things. So one of the findings of the UN Research Institute for Social Development, in short, it is called UNRISD, was if we don't have a good governance, implementation of Millennium Development Goals is not possible. So good governance is a precondition to active implementation of Millennium Development Goals. That was the conclusion of that research report. And they had given a case study of one of our neighboring country. So I actually quoted that when I was on the ground in that country. I don't want to name the country for political reasons. I was in the country and I named that, and I was pulled up, saying that you are the Indian naming a country on the soil of the country, because as a UN employee, you become what is called an international civil servant, which means you have access to all the countries. You are not to present your country of origin, your country of nationality, but you are representing United Nations without that nationality affiliation. And I was pulled up. But again, I said, I'm not saying something new here. I'm saying what has been published by another UN agency called UNRISD. So you basically question that report or change that report, but you cannot stop me from quoting. But anyway, that's again cutting it short, because it requires a moral courage to stand up to some of these issues. Because everywhere people will try and box you in particular ways that you need to behave or you need to operate. So 2013, I was at a stage in the UN Millennium Campaign where I was at a crossroad. I was already senior enough to be taken on board to be trained as a UN resident coordinator. UN chief of office in any country or a UN ambassador in a country is called a UN resident coordinator. So I had that option, or the other option was to leave UN. So those were the two options. And I used to critically say, sometimes jokingly, that the UN resident coordinator's job is to host cocktails and attend cocktails. Not necessarily, but in most of the cases, that is what the UN resident coordinators basically end up doing. So I said, that's not what I want to do. I want to do some meaningful, impactful work. So I want to go into a post-conflict country and do the work on the reconstruction, because I've done enough work now globally, regionally. I want to go back to the base, go back. But I wanted to do more challenging work in terms of post-conflict country. So that with my seniority, that kind of position was not available. And that is what led me to joining Amnesty International. Again, in case of Amnesty International, so the learning from the UN is very, 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 very key. That even if you're an international civil servant, there are boundaries in which you operate. We were really enjoying our work because we had concerts of A.R. Rahman hosted by UN Millennium Campaign, huge concerts in Delhi and other places. So it was like really accelerating work at one level, because you had access and contacts at the highest political level. You had contacts with a whole art and performing communities, because everybody who can identify themselves with the United Nations was useful. I had some chief ministers who were attending the UN General Assembly would connect with me and say, Minar, we are coming. Why don't you arrange some of these meetings for us? And we did a lot of those kinds of things during that period. We had 3 successive years. We overpassed our own achievement for the Guinness record in terms of number of people mobilized for standing up against poverty and for Millennium Development Goals. 3 years we surpassed our own kind of a goal, and the last one before I left was, I think, 107 million people, and out of 107 million people, 85 million people were from Asia Pacific region, which I was leading. So some of these are movements of pride that you face, because you were really organizing at a much bigger level with prime ministers actually doing the pledges in the public domain and those kinds of things. So huge amount of learning in that process. Amnesty, I will quickly in case of Amnesty again. important to look at how you relate and align your values. My values, again, I'm emphasizing building agency and voice for the people. Amnesty's model was human rights researchers going from London or from any of the Western European countries or from US, doing a human rights research, going back and publishing the report from London. I said, why can't we have human rights researchers from the region who will do the research and who will be able to convince and talk to the leadership in those countries much, much better? That's how the Moving Closer to the Ground program was outlined. One of the issues there was we could have done much, much more work in terms of taking the staff on board, because it was basically shifting out of 600 positions in London, shifting almost 300 positions outside of London, which meant that the 300 people who were already employed, their lives would be disrupted in that change process, a large change process of setting up the 15 offices. So key learning there is leaders do face what I call the toxic culture crisis. So again, that's one time when leadership, how true grit your leadership is, gets demonstrated. How you deal with toxic culture, how you really are empathetic in dealing with that. So I've talked about the adaptive grit. I've talked about now. In case of social sector leadership, it's not only the KPIs and the KRAs. What matters is also that emotional connect, because ultimately everybody who works with you also have to have a sense and continuous strengthening reaffirmation of the sense of dignity. So is that emotional, what we now call EQ, much more very strongly required. So with the adaptive grit, emotional data or emotional quotient, and the moral courage, those three in a way have guided those 4 decades of my work in the social sector. Since 2024, I came back to India, and since then I basically decided front-facing work I have done enough. I want to do now work in the background, helping leaders, organizations, leadership teams to build their institutions in a sustainable, ethical, compliant way. And that is how I began with this motivation for performance, MP, which also is my initials, Minar Pimple, but it's motivation for performance consulting basically. So that's what I started. So in conclusion, if you look at all the stages, you still need to remain what I call the activist heart, or what Professor Vora we were discussing. How do you keep yourself young, not in age, but young in your thinking, in your ideas? So how do you keep your activist heart? How do you keep the architect mind, creating institutions, building building structures that survive, even after you have gone long? And how do you become the ambassador of the voice and build a voice and agency among communities? So it's basically the 3 A's: activist, architect, ambassador. So how do we look at all those three as a key leadership kind of facets that we bring in, with a frame of deepening and strengthening democracy, with looking at building voice and agency among communities, with adaptive grit, with emotional intelligence, with moral courage? That's kind of a framing that, and then in just closing, I would say that, now, of course, everybody's talking about artificial intelligence. So I would, I've been thinking about it. I have not yet completely formulated, but the key question that I'm looking at is how AI could be deployed to develop or to enhance social impact, and not just as tools which are, tinkering around, clarifying certain operational pieces, which also must happen, but not how do we really look at AI to create that kind of a social impact going forward. And because I'm speaking at ADCLOD, one of the areas that is, of course, keen, because I always felt that from practice, you must build concepts and frameworks. From concepts and frameworks, you must build theory, and then that theory should inform your practice. And again, that circle should continue: practice, theory, praxis, enhance theory, enhance practice. So how do we, because one of your thing is to undertake research. One of the key things that I'm looking at, and what are the key differentiators beyond what is already identified between the social sector leadership and between the for-profit leadership? What are those key differentiators? And this question is becoming more and more important because I see a lot of transition of people, who are looking for meaning, who are looking for purpose, moving from the for-profit sector to not-for-profit sector. And many of them get frustrated very soon and go back. So how do you manage that transition? What are those key differentiators, and how do we bring them along? How do we really handhold them in the process? What kind of briefing sessions, training sessions, immersion sessions that can be managed for those people who are wanting to transition from for-profit sector to not-for-profit sector? So I think that's a key thing that we need to look at, and that's one of the suggestions I would give. Finally, to end, the most powerful thing you can do is be an example as a social sector leader, and that's what should remain with all of us, that we be the example in what we want to do. Thank you. I think I took maybe about 35-40 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Minarji, for sharing your almost 40 years of journey in 45 minutes. I think that itself is a feat on its own, and very interesting reflections on the work that you have done and the lessons that you have gleaned from that. Now is the time when panelists, participants and panelists, all of us can put our questions in chat if we have some. But while people are writing, there is one person who has already put in his question, and I want to read it out to you. He says, and I don't know, Swaminathan, what you are. Maybe a public servant is what you seem to be. But anyway, let me ask the question. You're saying I used to work in a SC dominant group of villages for a PSU in one of Tamil Nadu's most backward district. At least 10 villages of around 500 to 600 people each still did not have any toilets in their houses, and they were still resistant to any change till date. And for the past 1 year, I have seen this issue as the biggest threat to development, the resistance to change. How do we change this as a community and as a public servant with minimal authority? So here's a question. I mean, this person seems to have a problem that he wants to solve and has a view, if you have any answer for that.
Thank you, Mr. Swaminathan, for that question. Traditionally, any behavioral changes is extremely slow process, as many of us would understand. Like for example, laws on untouchability are, how many years old, but you still have pockets where this gets practiced. Manual scavenging. Again, another challenging area on which a number of people have actually done a lot of ground level work. So behavioral change is a very challenging area. Let's be clear about it. So let me start with that kind of a rider. So what you're actually dealing with in terms of the that behavioral change for those villages, predominantly SC dominated, scheduled caste dominated villages. There are 2-3 things that any change process is important. Is to actually keep in mind. One is, do we have people who could become the champions for that change from within the community? Who are those champions? I always do. Just yesterday, I was talking to somebody. I said, any change, you have people who are not bothered about it. There are people who are fence sitters, and there are people who are active or passive registers for that change. So we need to really identify who are those who are not too bothered about it. Whom can we onboard them to our side? Those who are on the fence, can we take it on our side of the fence? And then work out the methodology to really understand who are those passive or active registers, and from where their active or passive resistance is coming. What are the source of that? And then what are the kinds of intervention strategies that we must use? But this process does take long. It's not like a quick magical wand kind of a process, and many times we see that it Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it can go, if you get a very good champions who are strong, who are really capable of bringing about that change, who are willing to, put their neck on the line and, create a stake for themselves and others in that change, then that's feasible. That's the generic answer I can give you, because we can't get into more specifics than that at this stage. But thank you for that question.
Thank you. Arun or Ashank, if you have
Yeah.
a question.
I,
Yes.
I do have a question. So I mean, I have to start by saying that I was amazed, impressed, spellbound when you described your personal stories of really great courage, audacity, enterprise that you have shown in your professional career. I want to build on something that you mentioned about moral courage, and in fact, your entire address was hinged on moral courage. But today, to be morally courageous, maybe that was the case when you started out as well. One needs a lot of political courage as well, right? And that comes at a huge personal cost. So my question is more about the personal cost of moral courage. How did you manage it, or minimize it, or mitigate it in your own life?
Because we are a public forum, I cannot get into more details, but I've been one of the victims of the moral courage. Where victims of moral courage means being victimized because of the moral courage. Because speaking truth to the power comes with cost. It never comes without the cost. Let's be very straight and honest about it. Okay. So I can basically say that, but should I give up is the question. Okay. Because I always say the only thing that uh, nobody can take away from you, Professor Sri Kumar, is your hope for change, hope for better days, hope for better governance. And this is not a situation only in this country. I've seen that globally. In so many places, the civil society voices are being suppressed, oppressed, criminalized. Criminalized. That is what is happening in different parts of the world. So let's be straight and honest about it. So again, it's almost like a personal compass. Where you want to put your direction to be, and then each one with the kinds of background and the kinds of responsibilities we have takes a decision on where you want to be. Like there were a few years when I went little quiet in terms of how I want to present myself. About 1.5 years back, I said no, I think it's important that we launch something important. And that is when Gagan Sethi and myself launch a podcast called Unmute. The name itself shows very clearly that there is a muting process is happening in different parts of the world. Muting of voices of sanity. When I explained why unmute, I said there's a process of muting the voices of sanity and the growth of voices of insanity, and that is why podcast called Unmute. Okay, so that's again a courage. I wouldn't call it a political, personal, but yes, many of my friends said, "Why are you getting into this now?" I said, because you can't keep compromising with what you believe in. Of course, you then define your boundaries in a different kinds of fashion. But you still navigate that space. So it's and those what you can navigate, how much you can navigate is very clearly dependent on the personal choices and personal circumstances you are in. Okay, but I can't go more into detail, but I would love to talk to you sometime, Professor Sri Kumar, in terms of what are the ways and means I had to do to protect myself in some form or fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some very interesting questions from the audience. One question is about how can leaders balance empathy and accountability while working with vulnerable communities? And I think that's a great question to look at. Empathy and accountability. Yes, Ashank, you have a
No,
question.
no. I have a similar question.
Okay.
Question.
No, the question is about how do we maintain or how do we remain empathetic while also holding accountability, especially while working with the marginalized community. Is that the question that
That's the
that you
question
read
from
out?
Suresh Lule. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Suresh has been a colleague of mine in UA days, so thank you, Suresh, for asking that question. It's I always say leadership is a tight rope walk. There is nothing simple and straightforward. And when you look at like in my talk, I spoke about the strategy and empathy. Okay, how do we balance this when empathy leads to unaccountable behaviors and when empathy is still in the domain of accountability? Because sometimes empathy could be misinterpreted as free for all. That could be a situation, and that is when I think the leaders, one of the critical role of leaders is to continuously define boundaries, define the scope in which we operate, and what are the values which are guiding those boundaries. Because again, I come back to the question of values, because values must guide in your enforcement of your accountability and empathy both. Because, and if anything is outside the trajectory of the value that you believe in, that your institution believes in, then that is no go. That's a clarity that we should have. Many times we don't go back to what some of my friends call first principles. So the first principle here is, what are the values by which you're doing what you're doing, and whether what is being asked of you is within those boundaries of the values or not. That's a critical kind of a indicator by which you decide whether how to manage this conundrum between empathy and accountability. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Some very, very interesting questions are on the board. So one very simple question, just so that you also get a breather. Who's your role model?
Okay. No, that's an important question, because many times we don't necessarily talk about it. My just so that and not for any other reason, but just of power and privilege I spoke about. The social strata I come from is what in the caste hierarchy is Shudras, artisanal communities. Okay, I come from the coppersmith family. Basically, these are all the layer 4. And beyond those are Atishudras or untouchable communities. If you look at in terms of the pyramid, that's the last layer from where I come from. Unfortunately, even if I came from that community, there was no much big awareness about how some of the social reformers have influenced that community. Like if you say Mahatma Phule came from the Shudra community. He was a Mari by caste. I got to learn and know when I became a little more aware at the age of 16, 17, especially the post-emergency student activism that I got involved with. So it's Phule, Ambedkar, and then of course, as a young blood, of course, Shahid Bhagat Singh was a major kind of a role model for us. But Phule Ambedkar thought and how that defines and understands Indian context. And for the class perspective, this regular saying that, anybody in that period of 75, 76, 77, 78, if you are in any higher school of learning, important colleges, you would be Marxist. So somewhere, so I always used to say, for class, looking at the Marxist analysis. For the social analysis, look at Phule and Ambedkar. For the tactics, because that is what I learned in the School of Social Work, there is a writer who wrote a very important book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, called Paulo Freire, or Saul Alinsky, who wrote a book, Tactics for Radicals. These are people who have come from outside, but fundamentally locating your tactic within the Gandhian framework, a non-violent framework, within the constitutional framework, has been very critical for me. So that is how I have interpreted from the analysis to action, who guides me. And it's a eclectic way of looking at it, so that you don't become dogmatic. When you become dogmatic, you stop learning, and that's again a important leadership lesson. There was a time when I was dogmatic, when I would say right and wrong on the basis of, because this fits in my frame of analysis, whether that is really reflecting the reality or not. So you have to go beyond that dogma and be more fluid, but still be on the side of progressive interpretation of history, history which takes you forward rather than history that takes you backward. I hope I gave a little elaborate answer to that, but that I hope that's
That's a
useful.
beautiful answer. That's a beautiful answer. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There are some tactical questions that people have asked, and two I will put together. One is on funding and non-funding and foreign funding of the social sector, and the other is on the point of view of a social leader in the time of social media disruption. So those are, a couple of questions that are more in terms of the nitty-gritty of running the organization. If you have the time, it'd be very nice for you to.
Sure. I have kept my time, so no worries. Depending on when you guys want to close.
Yeah.
On the funding and non-funding, I would again don't take it as a promotion of the Unmute podcast, but do look at episode that we did with Ingrid Srinath. She really looks at the whole issue of funding, foreign funding, domestic funding, and what's a frame in which all this needs to be looked at. So that podcast name is Civil Society at Crossroads. So I would really encourage you to look at that podcast, because there you'll get, because it is not a straightforward answer, good, bad. It's not a straightforward. It's a much more nuanced. It's much more elaborate answer. So keeping that looking at the time, I'm not going into detail. But if somebody is interested in communicating with me directly and want to have a conversation, I'm absolutely willing to do that.
Right.
In terms of the social sector and social media, don't confuse your metrics with your social media presence. Let's begin with there. But that does not mean undermine social media and its role. Okay. So again, it's a tight rope walk. Many people start thinking that they are great because their social media presence is great. I'm sorry, that's not. Ultimately, the taste of pudding is in eating it. How much social impact have you really created on the communities, on the ground? How much change you have been responsible for creating that is attributable to you, among many other factors which contribute to any change process? That is the fundamental metrics by which you should analyze. Unfortunately, in some of the civil society sector today, social sector today, people evaluate their presence and impact by how many followers they have in a particular social media handle. That's a misplaced thing. That how many followers you have is important for your propagation of your work, but that does not necessarily confirm your impact of the work. So I'm saying be present, be tactical and strategic on social media from this perspective, and don't confuse it with the real impact on the ground.
Correct. Right. I think here is a very interesting question, and I do want to read this out to you. This is Pranav Chaitanya, who's saying, I work with government officials, especially district collectors, on areas like education and ECC. What advice would you give non-profits on getting officers to devote more time and attention to qualitative priorities, particularly when the outcomes are important but not immediately visible? I think it's a pertinent question that he's asking.
It's a pertinent question, but it's a question which demands another webinar because
I
it is
get you.
so elaborate, because it moves from the administrative reform, because the kinds of roles that the collectors are loaded with, if you actually look at the amount of roles, there was some counting somebody did of how many committees a collector is supposed to chair. Okay. And if you actually look at, if you calendarize every committee meeting, the collector will be only attending those committee meetings. Literally is that fashion. So that's one piece of it. Okay. Another thing, just a quick advice on that. I never treated any bureaucracy as a monolith. There are individuals who are interested in undertaking meaningful work. Okay, and how to leverage those individuals is critical. There was a time when every bureaucrat was like seen as an enemy. I don't believe that. I have always believed in, if I may say it on this webinar, I called it a kiss and kick tactic. So basically, there are areas where you can work together with the bureaucrats. There are areas where you need to be holding them accountable. That balance now is a little bit disturbed, as following from Sri Kumar's question, because that balance doesn't exist anymore. Whatever you do, you can be jammed. That's the reality that we face in a number of countries. But in spite of that, there are very, very good bureaucrats who are willing and committed to really pursuing certain key social and developmental indicators. So work with them, give your best, and get the best out of them. That's the only advice I would give. But you have to be very clear that they are also loaded with so many things and they are answerable in many instances to so many different stakeholders. So keeping all that in mind, how do you leverage your relationship, your work with them, and demonstrate results that will help you?
Thank you. There is a question from Q Boma, and maybe this question in one, and then we will definitely share. She says that just to mention that apart from your examples that you speak of moral courage, I also heard you talk between the lines about moments and situations where you spoke up against groupthink, which is social courage, dealt with difficult and not so helpful emotions, which is emotional courage, and showed humility, that is recognizing that others know more than that, which is intellectual courage. She just wants to say that maybe it's more than just moral courage that a leader
Oh,
shows. And I think very well articulated
no,
as
it's
well.
very well articulated. And Theo is he, if I'm saying, and thanks Theo for joining from Holland. I hope it's a right time for you to join. We are together in an advisory board on one of the social initiatives.
I see.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the very last question, again, this is a little more tactical, where where Dhananjay is asking, Dhananjay Kulkarni, many small organizations in social sector lack the processes and resources to improve the organizational structure. Is there any suggestions how to improve the structure?
Okay, there are two types of answers I'm going to give to this. Okay. Whether you like it or not, depending on the size of the organization and the kind of impact you create, your sustainability gets defined or constrained. Okay. So I'm also one of those people who basically believe, and I actually practiced it when I was part of UA by developing something called Vikas Sahyog, development collaboration. Again, it was a collective of the smaller NGOs, but who were aligned on the value frame. But by themselves, they wouldn't be, by themselves individually, they may not be impactful, but as a collective, they would be more impactful. Okay, so I'm not suggesting mergers here, but something of that kind. The era of individual organization sustenance, driven by values and a mission impact, is little bit now past. We have to really look at what kinds of networks we need to be part of, what kinds of collectives we need to be part of to enhance that impact. If that is what we want to do, and not just to remain, alive. Because what I see many small NGOs, I don't know Dhananjay's case, Dhananjay, but again, if you are from Maharashtra, want to connect with me sometime, we can connect, because I'm trying to work through some of those processes with smaller NGOs who could, who need to really rethink their tactics and strategies going forward. Otherwise, they will be in a continuous struggle for survival and not sustainability.
Great. Thank you. This was lovely, and I want to thank, first of all, the amazing audience that we had, which came up with really interesting questions. And of course, the audience is only as good as the speaker. And Mr. Pimple, that you have, with your very amazing story and the honesty and the lucidity with which you have been able to make a complex story simple, is commendable. So thank you very much. Thank you, Sukruti, for putting it all together at this point of time. And I think I would just request the audience to keep to continue to look out for our notifications, and we might have other speakers, other podcasts that we will put out. So please support us and make this your home for asking and thinking about leadership and organizational development questions. So we really look forward to connecting with you in the future. And thank you, all of you, and thank you, Arun, for staying and asking a great question. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.